You know what it is? I love it.
So we got Abraham, we have the flood, and we have the fall, and we have creation. Those are kind of the four major areas we've talked about so far with the good news. Now let's talk about Moses. And I think that there's like a flaw in what I'm doing a little bit, in that I'm kind of like, there's a flaw in the factoid method of reading the Bible. There's a flaw in like, and here's a thesis, and here's a thesis, and here's a thesis. Like the Bible is not made for just like pulling out little theses, right? It's kind of like a whole formation. So in talking about Moses, I think instead of just talking about the particular like definitive acts that we can pull out as good news, like maybe the founding of the temple or whatever, or the founding of the tent of meeting rather, or the Ten Commandments, I think it's very important with Moses to like try to get our head around the way God's working in this story. The closest thing I can come out is pull out the righteous underdog idea, but I think that doesn't do justice to what's going on with Moses. The situation of the world when Moses is born is the Israelites are the slave group in Egypt. The oppressive group is so scared of them, it's killing all their kids, or all their male kids, and assumedly exploiting their female children. And that Moses is born into this, and that Moses is abandoned at birth, but found and adopted by the royal family of Egypt. So here he is, a Jew, found and adopted by the royal family as one of their own, not as a slave, right? That's really interesting, and I really think that there's like so much to say about that that's not said in the Bible, and that you can let your imagination go on, right? And I think that's the movie, guy's name Cecil B. DeMille or whatever, the Ten Commandment movie, is amazing for how it doesn't let any single word in the story of Moses drop without being portrayed. But at the same time, it's like trying to fill in these amazing gaps in the story, like him being raised in the royal family. And then, due to this, him discovering his roots and him kind of in a bad way working for justice amongst the Jewish people by killing an Egyptian and things like this, he gets in a situation where his own people hate him and the Egyptians hate him, and he has to run for his life, right? That's also kind of an interesting part of his development. And not only does he run for his life, he runs for his life straight out into the desert of Saudi Arabia, basically, right? And it's not like he goes there for a couple months. He goes there for 30 years. He lives most of his life probably out there, or at least a third of his life is out there, And it's not just a third of his life where he's like some weird desert monk. He marries and everything, and he marries a non-Jew, He marries someone living out there in the desert, and he is not a forceful personality, not the same man you'd think of when you think of someone raised in the Egyptian royal family who would go strike down a Egyptian persecutor and kill him. He stutters, and he's a sheep herder, right? And then that this is the man who's been rejected by the Egyptians, rejected by the Jews, married to an Arab woman and herding sheep professionally and stuttering. This is the man who God says, you are going to be my leader. You are going to be the one I work through to change history, and to reveal to all of mankind something about myself, is you, right? And he gets him, and he sends him back to Egypt, which is not without event. His wife doesn't like it, and he almost gets struck down in this whole thing, and he doesn't even think he can do it, and he says, I even stutter, so how can I be your mouthpiece, right? And he has to get help from a relative to do his preaching. And he gets to Egypt, and then how does he get him out of Egypt? Does he get him out of Egypt by going around and killing Egyptian persecutors like he did, when he was run out of Egypt? No. He does it in the most obviously supernatural way possible. There's no, whenever you have a rebel group that's going to have a revolution, whenever you have a enslaved group that's going to rebel, there's usually you can usually say, okay, God helped them, they beat a more powerful force. Another way you could say, you could make some excuses and say, well, they had a really great leader, and there was really, and maybe, they really had worked hard. You have all these like little worldly ways that maybe they won their own liberation. But the Jews out of Egypt is like the Jews didn't do it story you can come up with. It's frogs, it's flies, it's bloody water, it's angels going around and killing firstborn sons. It's just this weird, like liberation that's totally supernatural. And at the end, it's not just a liberation, it's a conquering army leaving. It's, here's all our gold, leave us and just go away, And then, just to make things even more dramatic, the people who gave him all the gold and let him leave are like, hold it, we regret what we did. We're coming out with the most badass army in the ancient world, and we are going to kick your butt, and bring you back as our slaves. And then instead of God letting the Jews with their pitchforks fight the chariots and conquer, God stands between them in a cloud and says, don't mess with my people. And then he opens up a sea, walks his people through it, and has it clog up chariot wheels and drown a bunch of Egyptians, tragically, or not tragically. And it also appears that God's even manipulating the whole thing at the level of hardening Pharaoh's heart, like withdrawing grace from Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh, is doing like almost these irrationally mean things, to the Jewish people. So this is who Moses is, right? And this is like the context of the story. And I don't have like a single fact out of that to say, and this is what we need to learn from it. It's just like this wild, amazing story, but shows that the reality of God, his option for this enslaved people, he's not just the God of the powerful, and all this stuff is all being illustrated by this. How Moses was not fit to lead his people out of Egypt when he's like in the royal court, working for justice, killing the Egyptian oppressor, but he is somehow fit to lead his people out of Egypt, or God chose him rather. Maybe he's not ever fit to do it when he's like, living in the desert, married to this Arabian woman. And I think another idea is like we're talking about like, I believe that the Jewish religion is much more open to outsiders than it appears from afar. I think Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. I hope I'm right on that one. It's on tape. But anyway, Moses' father-in-law even plays this important role in the Jewish people. He like walks into camp, and here is Moses, the greatest Jew, perhaps the greatest man who ever lived up to this point. And Jethro's like, Moses, you're not even organizing this right. You need to have all these sub-judges, and he like gives some advice, and Moses does it. He obeys his father-in-law, who's not Jewish. He's a Bedouin guy from the Arabian desert. And then Moses is like, hey, you want to stay with us? And the guy's like, nah, I'm going to go be a Bedouin. Later. And he leaves. But there are these defining things that Moses is doing that are not just a story. They're things that change our religion forever. And when St. Anthony the Great was talking about this history of salvation as he thought about it, where it was like this dumbing down of mankind over the long period, he considered Moses to be the founding of the church. And I think, this sounds really radical to us, he considered Moses the founder of the Catholic Church. Right? And I think, in a Catholic perspective, Moses is the founder of the Catholic Church. It's just not something you'd hear said now. But he is the one who started church worship. He's the one who started the priesthood. He's the one who gave us our first scriptures. Everything that we are taking like for granted as religion today, going to church, having scripture, having people who lead our services as priests and make sacrifices. This is all starting at Moses, right? I say that knowing that Melchizedek is a priest that appears before Moses, but his very presence is a super mystery, and that's why the New Testament has to talk about it all the time, is because Melchizedek is such a weird figure that he comes from nowhere. He's a priest of the true God, and he disappears into nowhere. Whereas like Moses is starting up the priesthood as an institution, you know. So what is the good news about this, right? The good news is kind of as St. Anthony the Great's thinking about it, we're kind of getting dumbed down, and we need help. Like, we need help to follow God, and what is the form this help's going to take? It's going to take the form of common worship in a church. It's going to take the form of religious leadership and a priesthood. And that help's also going to take the form of the written word. The other thing that's going to happen is I think that secular society doesn't really deal with this problem, although I think everybody can sympathize with this problem, is there's this issue of scrupulosity. That if you're trying to be good, or you're trying to do project make yourself perfect or whatever, this is just a big failure of a project, because there's always a million things you can do that you didn't do, right? And there's always a million textured issues within just judging yourself, which ends up being an insane activity. And what Moses did was Moses gave us a great grace by saying, here's the 10 commandments. Here's the 10 major principles. This is a bright line standard for sin. Things get out of hand when we're thinking of, there's a woman today in my neighborhood who goes around with a shopping cart to all the recycling bins and takes out all the cans, right? And I was sitting on my porch when she came by, and I thought about giving her money, right? And I did not. If I thought that sin and the whole balance of the world was hinging on my decision to give her money right there, I could become obsessed with all these decisions in my life. I'm not saying that it's totally unimportant whether or not I choose to give her money right then, right? But I'm not going to go to confession about it, I'm wondering if certain people think I should have given her money to such a high degree. But there's the moral problem can be infinitely complex, and if you let it become infinitely complex and act like the whole world hangs on every little thing, you end up being totally worthless as a Christian and not useful in the service of God. An example of this is, Teresa was right, I did research into this, is Pepsi Cola using aborted fetuses thing. And what it is that there's a biotechnology company that's using one line of stem cells for determining, as you said, the most innate taste buds in humans, that are genetically innate, and they're using this line of stem cells from the 70s, if you guys remember when George Bush was talking about stem cell research, he's all pre-existing lines he was going to bless as okay to continue using these lines of stem cells, but no one was going to harvest new lines of stem cells, meaning new abortions were going to be used for stem cells. So it's one of those pre-existing lines, and they were using it to do it, and all these and so what happened was this biotech company with this great claim that they could do this got a lot of the players in the food industry to give them contracts, and then most of those players appear to have taken away their contracts because of protests by the pro-life community, but in no way does... Anyway, I say that to mean that you can get so complex in the moral things that's can you ever drink Pepsi again? Or somehow is that wrong, right? And when Christianity gets obsessed with those decisions and gets away from this decision of whether or not you love, and how you're going to exercise this radical love, we become paralyzed as Christians and don't live our vocation, And it's not to say that, talking about it's wrong, it's obsessing on it's wrong. And that's when Christianity gets to be discussions of that as opposed to the big picture, we're wrong. What Moses is doing, so why is this important? What Moses is doing is he's creating a bright light standard. He's saying, if you fall on one of these 10 things on the wrong side, you need to stop what you're doing and rethink your life and repent. I'm kind of against when we go into these confessionals and they have these here are the 10 commandments and here's 15 questions about each commandment, exploring every little possible sin of thought you could have done in relation to one of those 10 commandments. They're taking the 10 commandments and then blowing them up into possibly something that will feed scrupulosity, that'll just make you feel horrible all the time and like rob you of the freedom of being the sons of Christ. And it doesn't necessarily do that, but there's tons of people who it is affecting that way. And I don't think that's the original intention of it, where Moses would have sat down and done it himself. There's no great genius in this blowing up of these rules, right? And you could almost say that's what the Jewish people did, is they took the rules of Moses and they make the rules on top of the rules. There's this Jewish concept that's interesting where this is all right, unfortunately, I think this is an explanation of scrupulosity. It happens in Catholicism and Judaism. The idea in Judaism is, if God gave you a set of rules and you love God, you'll follow those rules, right? You know what you'll also do? You'll build a hedge around those rules, so you never even get close to breaking any of those rules. So a simple example is the writings of Moses say, do not boil a calf in its mother's milk. Well, that's a rule. Okay, I'm not going to do that, right? Well, if you really love God, why don't you never boil a calf in somebody else's milk either? And then what if you never boil a cow in goat milk? Well, what if you never boil milk at all? And what if you never let cheese touch meat in any dish? And what if you have a different set of plates so that your cheese plates are totally separate than your beef plates? What if you have, I'm not lying yet, I'm not making something yet. What if you have two different dishwashers in your kitchen so that your beef plates go into one dishwasher and your milk plates go into one dishwasher, so that somehow there's never any cross-contamination? What this is this idea that the road to holiness is knowing the law of God and then creating another installation law around it, a hedge, and then another, and then another. And the greatest lover of God is the one who is a million miles away and running two dishwashers from ever offending God in any way, right? And this is not the Christian conception. And what I'm saying is not a bright line, right? Like, why aren't we dealing with chastity the way Islam deals with chastity? Wouldn't that remove the occasion of sin if we never let any woman ever show her face? Right? I mean, if you were really hardcore about never wanting to have lustful thoughts, would that not help? Or does it? Or is that what God's really willing here? So there is a measure in all of that has to be observed. And if your measure is like this extremist measure, you're never going to come to the right decision. And unfortunately, the real damning thing that people have to admit is they will be totally castrated as Christians. They are not going to do good work for the kingdom and unfortunately, this is a spiritual disease. It's a communicable disease. When we have a group of Christians and one person's talking about, you don't really love God. This is what they're saying, although they don't say it this way. You don't really love God unless you do this extra thing. When people talk that way, they're spreading their own contagion of scrupulosity, right? And it affects Christian groups all the time, and I guess the right way to do it is to be in a Christian group and say, hey, I think we could better love God by X, or we could better, talk in terms of growing in love as opposed to never offending, because never offending can become an all-encompassing mental disease, literally, psychologically a mental disease. And and certain groups have been known to attract more mentally unhealthy people, and certain groups have been known to cause people to be more mentally unhealthy. They're usually the same groups, but it's kind of a scary thing, I think. And I think that when you look at the life of Jesus, who was he the hardest on? Right? He wasn't the hardest on the prostitute who's clearly running afoul of one of the 10 Commandments. You might be wondering what I mean prostitute. The woman caught in the act of adultery, the woman washing his feet, who was of bad reputation, the woman at the well. Like, these 3 women have all run against the 10 Commandments in an obvious way, right? He was not hitting them on the head with a bat, right? The people he saved the bat for were Sadducees and Pharisees, right? And more Pharisees were the more legalistic of the two. The Sadducees at that time were kind of sellouts to power. But it's those people who can get caught in making religion something not good, and they're doing it through this mental disease of scrupulosity, basically. All right, so when Moses gives the Ten Commandments, this is a relief. We all worry that we're in sin. We all do have sin. But the Ten Commandments can, in a sense, help us judge by delineating a bright line and also delineating the 10 big things. Don't do this and be free. That doesn't mean that everything you do that's not a violation of the Ten Commandments is the best thing in the world. It just means that, like when the young man comes to Jesus and says, what do I need to do to be saved? He says, follow the Ten Commandments, basically. And then he says something else, about if you were to be perfect, right? The other thing is the church and Scripture as a guide is a very important thing, that you're not on your own. That, like when we talked earlier about how the concupiscence or the problem within our own self that distorts the way we feel and our instincts, but it also distorts our very reason and judgment. How are we going to be helped out of this? Well, Moses is the great giver of the law. Moses is the person who started church, in a sense. Not in a sense, he started it. He's also the one who gave Scripture for the first time. This is huge helps in us getting out of our own false selves, and seeing clearly again. And so this is a huge, help. So if you were to think of this as the history of humanity, this is when God in the history of humanity gave humanity a whole lot of help. Particularly church, Scripture, law was at this point, right? And that's kind of the legacy of Moses, or the true. That's why he's such an important figure in all these major world religions too. The other thing that I think is interesting that Christianity runs with from Moses is when God presents himself to Moses, Moses says, and who should I say that you are? Like when I go to the Jewish people, who am I supposed to say sent me? And God says, I am, as who he is. That is an amazing statement when taken in the light of Greek philosophy, right? It's kind of like saying God is being, or God is the self-existent thing. It's that thing saying that he is the God of the philosophers. He is that, it's like unifying these two concepts. He's not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, which he fully is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. But he's also the I am, the philosophical God, right? This is important. Christianity is the one who really runs with this when it kind of marries the religion with Greek philosophy. This is important because it means that God is rational or is reasonable, and not all world religions believe this, that God could be above reason, created rationality, and thus God does not have to obey his own rationality because God's beyond this rationality, right? In this statement from the Old Testament, from Moses, there's this idea that we're going to start merging these concepts of God, right? To the first so many centuries of Christians, this was obvious. Like this whole idea of the Word, when John claims that Jesus is the Word, that is a term from Greece, in a sense, that starts bringing these two concepts together. And there's a little bit of revisionist theologizing happening, saying that this is what Moses, necessarily what the primary meaning was in his day of God is the great I am, But it's not to say it's an accident either. That's not why God revealed himself at that time as I am, is because of what's going to happen thousands of years later too. So we had Moses, and we kind of brought the good news up to Moses. I love the life of David. It reemphasizes everything that we want to say about righteous underdog. He's the ultimate example. It's awesome. But then we get to this prophetic period where the prophets are writing their lamentations, they're writing their prophecies. They're kind of experiencing this great yearning, and they're also correcting society at the same time. And they're kind of saying something is missing. It has to do with justice. It has to do with heaven and poor. It has to do with us still being, sinful, even though they're the chosen people and they have the law and they're got the temple. But something is just amiss with all of this, and they can't name it. I'd say the closest prophet to prophesying Christ, it seems to me, is Isaiah, or what they say is called Second Isaiah or something. But it's Isaiah. Some of his prophecies are pretty amazing. But it's like beyond the human mind what is needed, to solve the dilemma of mankind, right? And then the prophecy peters out, which is interesting. There's this kind of dead prophet period before Christ where there aren't prophets like there used to be. They are not used to seeing people, the Holy Spirit working through someone so directly. And it's within that period that the Holy Spirit does something unheard of, and we have the Immaculate Conception. And for those people who don't read a lot of Catholic stuff, that is not the conception of Jesus. That's the conception of Mary and her mother. And this Immaculate Conception is amazing, is that what we believe is that Mary is sinless, but not by, in a sense, her virtue, but because she is sustained that way by supernatural grace. So the way I think of that, I think a meaningful distinction there would be if Eve had never eaten the apple and lived her whole life in the Garden of Eden, living the perfection that she would have had in that state, she would have been naturally perfect, in a sense. Like, due to her own natural virtue, she would have sustained that perfection, would be the idea, right? Jesus, in a sense, due to his natural virtue, sustained his own perfection. Mary did not. She was held perfect, but it was like a continuous miracle that this was happening. And it is her being, and it's actually the same miracle that I think, I'm not a good enough theologian to tell you this for a fact, but I think it's in a sense very analogous to the type of perfection that we are all striving for with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit after Pentecost, is the same, that we're going to be supernaturally sustained as perfect. Of course, we all fail at that. We don't quite have it the way the Virgin Mary had it. But it's more akin to that type of perfection than the Garden of Eden type before the fall. All right. So this is why, that analogy I just made is why Mary is called the new Eve, right? So what we have here is we have paradise. We who were forced out of paradise due to the fall, and because we had done something that made it no longer paradise. But now, in maybe a manner of words, paradise is being forced back into creation at the Immaculate Conception. It's like the perfection is being forced back into the world. Does that weird anybody out as a statement? Okay, so she's this new perfection that's being brought back in the world. She's the first of many. She is the new Eve because of this. And it's very remarkable. In the Old Testament, I like all the prophecies for the simple people. For a term in the Old Testament is the people of the land, meaning like they're not the elite, they're not established in any way, they're just commoners, serfs, of the Old Testament, right? And there are times when the people of the land know right from wrong, and all the elites don't. There's a time where there's kings that are, there's kind of a coup in Israel, and it's the people in the land who have to put the rightful king back on his throne. When the Jews are carried off into captivity, it's often, I think it was mostly the people of the land who were not carried off into captivity and were allowed to remain in Israel. And it's from these kind of poorer Israelites that Jesus is born. He is, but God always has both. It's like David is the ultimate underdog. David was also dashing good looking and a really strong guy. It's like he's discriminated against, there's all these things working against him, but he's also really great. It seems like God always gets both in one. So Jesus is born of a terribly poor family that then becomes homeless. They're also royalty, at the same time. But their poverty is very important, and it's not like a mythical poverty. It's like a real grinding poverty. It's a poverty that A woman 9 months pregnant has to go on a great journey by donkey. It's a poverty where they have to take whatever gold they've been given by wealthy people as a gift and just run for their lives into Egypt. Visiting a foreign country back in the day like that was a little bit different than visiting a foreign country today, where IKEA has been the great common denominator, and Walmart is come to averaging out the whole world. This was like way more radical, a transition. And has to live there until he comes back as a refugee, essentially, to his own land. I once went to this reception by this priest who I really admired. He was a poet, and he was an Australian Jesuit and very notable professor. And he was like a visiting professor at Georgetown. And I went to like the Georgetown Christmas party where the Jesuits all were. And he was a little bit intoxicated. I kind of, how your nose can turn red or something when you become intoxicated. And he was just like, I was told that I needed to ask him about his theory. I don't even remember what it was about. It's like the common man or something like this. So I went up there and I said, so-and-so told me to ask you this. And he goes, with his wine bottle, well, you just got to know that, the Virgin Mary would have smelled like chickpeas. Wouldn't have washed very much either. And I was sitting there like, well, this is so like non-shocking. But I think it is shocking, right? And I think a lot of people aren't at home with this idea that they would have eaten chickpeas every day. They didn't have indoor toilets. They were very dirty. The Immaculate Conception, as shown in not the backside, but the Annunciation of Jesus unto Mary, where they're all in this clean, flowing regal clothes and everything, is not the way the thing went down, But this is like a very huge truth of our faith. Like, you're not doing the faith any service by taking Mary out of that context, right? Her perfection is in that context. It's not in an ivy tower. It's in a mud floor hut, So she is the new Eve, and she is the setting for the incarnation. So with this, we have a God that has decided to make his entrance into the world. And he can do it any way he wants to. He just become a real Pharaoh king. He could do anything he wants to, but he chooses to make his entrance in Nazareth to a poor girl who's not married in a dirt floor hut. Right? And it's kind of the ultimate type of majesty he's displaying. If you look up great American rugby teams, or like the best teams in the U.S., there's one called Old Blue, and they play out of New York City. And if you go see pictures of them playing, they often wear pink uniforms, even though their name is Old Blue. And they wear pink because they are the biggest, baddest team ever. And so they can get away with showing up to a manliness contest wearing pink. And it's as if God, in his I am the most powerful thing in the universe, has no need of the trappings of power. Has no need to put on airs, and he comes in this way. And I think that it shows great majesty in the same way that if you meet someone who's extremely rich, or royalty, or the President of the United States, it's striking that they're smart. It's striking that they're witty. It's striking that they could be all these different things, and you may kind of want to be like them, But it's even more striking if, without being a stunt, without being making a show of things or whatever, they very naturally do something humble. They change the sheets for their guests, or clean their own bathroom, or something like this. And you just can get a sense of, it's like a greater majesty that they would do that given their office, right? It's the majesty of like humility, right? And God is humble. So that's an interesting idea, because we were talking before about whether or not humility is merely knowing the truth of yourself in relation to the outside world. But in this case, like, the truth of God in relationship to the world is that he's just the awesome, the bestest, and the greatest, right? And yet he deigns to be born in a lowly estate, right? And then to apparently be unproductive for 30 years. You know, as Father Adam would say, Jesus Christ has a bad business plan. He would have failed like the MBA class. He would have said, "This is what I'm going to do for the first 30 years of my life." They've been like, "Oh, not productive enough." But there's something in this that's to tell us that this is good also, you know, to give us dignity in what we're doing in this like ordinariness of ourselves, right? And I think that this is a very nice thing, a very good thing. That if you could imagine, you know, 15 different pictures of an all-powerful God, this would be the weirdest. You know, and it's good news that it's this way. It's shocking good news that it's this way. So God lives his life poor and quiet. He is perfectly good, but he doesn't hang out with the goodest people in society. He hangs out with corrupt people, and he hangs out with lowly people, with uneducated people. And I think that should give us courage as a piece of good news that he loves us and he's willing to associate with us, even us, you know. It's a great democraticness of God, which, if you think of the opposite of this, there's been other religions where God was for the king, or God was more in touch with the king than he was the commoner. Or in a Hindu society where you have this caste system where it's not only a social hierarchy of money, it's also a hierarchy of spiritual fitness. That's a very cruel way to live. You're not only the poor, you're also the less loved, or the worst, or the, you know, morally badder than the rest of society. Whereas in the Christian society, the peasant can be the great saint, the king can go to hell. Everyone kind of always knows that. And thus, when you obey the king or obey the duke, there's always a little bit of a joke in it. You kind of know it's of this world, and you know that the duke could still be in error, the duke could still go to hell. He's not like a theocracy king like that. And in another sense, may God forgive me and the church for understand this, even the Pope's that way, you know, and it's okay it's that way. And it should kind of give us more confidence that it's that way, that he's not like at all times necessarily the most perfect, you know. He's doing a very important job, and it really helps the more holy he is, but that's not the Catholic teaching that he's the most perfect of humans and therefore the Pope. Otherwise, Mary would be the first Pope. So Jesus then comes into his public ministry. He's done all this associating with the lowly. And all the good news inherent in that lifestyle and that setting is all really good. But then he's coming out publicly, and he is saying 3 or 4 things to just totally turn the world on its head. He literally says it's on its head because the first are going to be last and the last are going to be first. And then he takes all the values that are normally thought of by humans, like the poor are not as blessed as the rich. He flips that on its head. Blessed be the poor. You know, the people who are sad are not necessarily are more cursed than the people who can party all the time and have a good time. He says, he flips that on his head. Blessed are those who mourn. And he just goes through all these values where he's like inverting all human values, you know. And he even inverts love. And he says, don't love your family. Any old person can do that. Love your enemies. I mean, well, he says do love your family, but you also love your enemies. And he also taught us that we've been talking about personalism. We've been talking about how we're created in God's image. That's an evidence of personalism. We've been talking about Abraham and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that's an evidence of personalism. And then Jesus comes in and he says, by the way, call God Father or call God Daddy, right? All right, now we've got a whole new level of personalism that just hit the scene with the Lord. And he also rejuvenates the same structure that Moses set up into a new structure of church. Not totally continuous, but has a whole lot of features of the old structure too, of the new Mass, you know. He's like rejuvenating that also in his public ministry. And with this church, he gives sacraments, which are kind of a greater thing than what had been had before. Like, it's not just like killing a bull at the temple or whatever. We now have these things that are kind of guaranteed that as they happen on earth, something is happening in heaven. As they happen on earth, a certain grace, a supernatural grace is being bestowed. And this is nice. It's also nice for the same reason. It's nice because you can have a supernatural grace. It's also nice that it's so definitive. It's not that God has ever said, I'm cheap with you, I'm not giving you grace, which I think is something we need to dare ourselves to think more clearly about. If he gives you $1 million, if he gives you the greatest grace in the world, he's less nothing, right? It's irrelevant for him to give the maximum gift or to give the infinite gift because it doesn't take anything away from him. And so for us to be fearful to ask for that just doesn't make sense. It's almost like doubting God in our very own prayer, you know. But what's also nice about these sacraments is that they're like the Ten Commandments. They kind of like take things out of the fuzzy zone where you're like, well, am I really a member of a church? I haven't done so much. Are you baptized? You know? Then you are. Boom. You got it. You know, it definitively happened, right? Am I really communing with God? Well, did you take communion? Boom. You know? And it's not true to think that that's the only way God's ever communed with anybody, right? But it is true to think that that's very nice, you know, to have that, right? Am I really been forgiven my sins? Was I really penitent? And he like says, well, we'll use him in intermediaries and we'll confirm it for you, you know, and have the stamp of, you know, approval or whatever on this, right? And if you've ever met anybody who asks forgiveness all the time, but they're not sure they're forgiven. They do this with humans. Like somebody can ask you for forgiveness repeatedly, and you're like, "You're forgiven. Shut up." People do that to God, right? But there's also these people who just are never convinced that God can forgive their sins, right? And it's through these sacraments that hopefully we're creating these structures against scrupulosity and freeing people to work better for the kingdom and live more, you know, full lives. There's also this idea of marriage, which I think is great. There's the idea of holy orders, which is a great blessing that we know who the priesthood is. But there's also this idea that marriage has always just been impossible. It's like it's written in the Bible, basically, it's impossible. It's like somebody asked about divorcing wives, and Jesus said, tell you the truth, you shouldn't be divorcing at all. You're asking me kind of an irrelevant question, not a technicality of divorce, but don't be divorcing at all. And then the apostles say, then who's going to get married? Like they're saying, but it's impossible to get married if you don't have the option of divorce. And Jesus, you know, honors celibacy and says, for those who can handle that, do, right? But what he's doing with this Christian sacrament of marriage is we're taking marriage to the next level. It's like God is blessing romantic love at this level that every first love teenager would love. You know what I mean? He's like saying, yes, it can be forever, it can be total, and it can be this great thing, and it can have the sacramental grace to go on. It is supernatural. Like romantic love is brought to a supernatural level by the sacrament of marriage, which is great. So we know that even after Jesus dies, he has this church for us, these sacraments, so we know he has not abandoned us. We know that we can think of God as our Father from the words of Jesus, and that we can become his adopted son as we think of him as our Father, and that we're not just at the level, we're not limited to a level of a religion that's just like, I have to be religious so I don't go to hell, or I want to be religious because I really want to go to heaven, or oh, there's this dude up there, and you know he likes me, I like him, so I'll get to go to heaven. But it's actually as if we're in the same family. It's this highest level of relationship where I deeply love him, I'm deeply allegiant to him, he deeply loves me, he's deeply allegiant to me. I know I'm never going to be abandoned or forgot about or anything like this with this type of loving relationship with God. We also know that the angels are real, that the saints are real, that there's this communion of Christians that is not just of this world, but is, intergalactic intertime-wise group, a communion of saints. It just means we're not alone, and that no matter how junky your life gets and how pitiful it seems in so many ways, there's almost certainly a saint that you can relate with that way. There's something similar, and not just that, but they are working as a team with the Lord to help us and serve us in this life. But something that meant a lot to me is Christianity opens up for me. I would hope this is true, but I can't guarantee you it is true. I would hope it's true that the human heart needs a crusade, that the human heart needs dragons to go slay, that to be fully human means to want to have something like that. I'm not sure that's true, but I know it's true for me. And I think that a lot of the reason why a lot of people, particularly guys, might escape into some fantasy where there are great crusades and there are quests and there are damsels in distress and there are these dragons that need killed is because it's just in them to want to have that all or nothing adventure, I think of it as being Napoleon, like someone who's just like got all the chutzpah, I hate using words I don't even know their meaning on film. But he's got all the ambition in the world, just totally unbridled. He's I'm going to take over the world and reform it to the Napoleonic Code, of course, that type of, ambition has a place, but it's all flipped on its head by Christianity. That this idea of holiness, this idea of giving yourself totally to the Lord, be that as some crazy Carthusian monk, be that as one of the crazy desert fathers, or I have to use the word crazy because what they're trying to do is so bigger vision than us want to try, or this idea that we can be at Simple House and we're 8 people right now, but you know what? We plan on changing the whole world, Not just our block, not just our city, but the whole world, and that this is not wrong. This is good, and this is the challenge that lays before us, We've been given Mission Impossible. You could agree with everything I just said, but my last statement is the one that I really mean. That's good news, I wanted Mission Impossible. I needed Mission Impossible. Becoming the richest man in the world is Mission Possible, 1, but 2, it's just stupid at the end of the day, Whereas the Christianity gives you that mission that is Mission Impossible and ultimately the most meaningful mission. I would say that this idea and a previous idea I talked about us not being beasts, us not just being in a situation where it just scratch it, these are the 2 things that get me out of existential crisis and depression. You know what I mean? I want that much meaning. Give me the Napoleonic crusade, right? That gives my life meaning. I also don't want to be reduced to scratching my crotch, But that's what I feel the modern world can take away from you. It can take away from you the dignity of truly being supernatural and leave you as a beast. And it can also take away from you even the idea of real fulfillment by a great romantic life, and I'm very sympathetic with anybody who's depressed if they're focused on those 2 things. If they boiled down their life to one of those 2 things. Okay, so God redefines everything for us, gives us more information about himself via Jesus Christ than he has ever. It's like if God's been bringing us along ever since creation, teaching us about himself, at Jesus Christ we are on fast forward. God is here on earth teaching us about himself, and we cannot handle the challenge. And the same instinct that put us in the bushes is an instinct that we've got to get this man out of our presence, and this is why he's taken outside the gates and crucified. And God is so humble that not only was he born with Mary in the hut and a refugee and all these different things, he's so humble, he gives himself over to our wishes to not even be around him and our violent wishes to try to destroy him in the process. But then, as all true power allows true humility in a sense, he lets this all happen, and then by his own power raises himself from the dead. I think it's always striking to me that like there's other people who've been raised from the dead, be it by a prophet or even be it by a doctor. But there's only one man who rose himself from the dead, or raised himself from the dead, just by, and as if it were nothing. You know, like just he can do it, right? And what's also neat about this is when he's resurrected, not only does it validate everything he says, and that the whole inversion of values has now got credibility more, but he also resurrects his physical body, right? And I think I always had chalked it up to mystery, but whenever you hear of heaven as a merely spiritual place, you just kind of like sit there and you think, what would it be like to be just spiritually flying around heaven? Why wouldn't we be flying around? Because I wouldn't, like, it just doesn't make sense, right? At some level, your mind can't even grasp what it would be like to be somewhere without your body, right? And in the Christian teaching, the reason why you can't grasp that is because you're not going to really be there without your body. There is a resurrection of the body. And Jesus is testifying to this by resurrecting his own body and showing its value. Jesus' body is totally mutilated. He can fix it. We're always worried, like in the analogy of the Rolls Royce being parked in the barn and all seized up, we're always worried, are we damaged beyond fixing? If you send any Ford back to the Ford factory, I'm sure they've got the dies around there to fix it. You know, we're being sent back to the factory, to the person who made us. There's nothing that could be wrong with us that he cannot redo, you know. And death is this gateway from this imperfect life into eternity, which we have faith is perfect. And Jesus is the one who went through that gate, came back from the other side, and told us what it was like and gave us directions on how to get there. You know, pointed the way, rather. With that, after doing that for a while, he says, I must go so that the Helper can be with you. And then he leaves us, and after a period comes Pentecost and a more radical descent of the Holy Spirit, of the Lord not living with us in the sense of like being in the room with us, but living with us in the sense of being in us. And not, I've often looked in the Old Testament when you think about the Spirit helping people in the Old Testament, and possibly, you know, King David, you know, being with the Spirit at different times, right? But this is like Pentecost is like the most grandiose dispensation of the Spirit the world has ever known. You know, ongoing unto today. This new, it's not that it's a new reality in the sense that no one had ever been with the Spirit before, but it's a new reality in the sense of its totality of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And then let's talk about, and with that, I think salvation in history in some level ends. You know, that the revelation that God keeps ongoing giving us about himself gets refined after that point, but that's kind of Pentecost is almost, I'd say, the end of the general revelation of brand new stuff, you know. I don't know if I'm putting that well, and may some theologian correct me someday to put it correctly, but there's still yet all this stuff to happen, not just all the last 2,000 years of the church, but even at the end of time, the judgments that are going to happen, that we're told that the truth of every individual is going to be told, that all your hidden vices, and I tend to think that the only truth that's going to be still relevant is not going to be like what score you got on your SAT that maybe you didn't tell anybody about, but it's going to be the truth of virtue and the truth of sin is going to be told, and this is going to be told in this final judgment. And that there will be a justice, that the Bible's final word is there will be justice, and there will be this grand reckoning of it. And it's those people who really want that justice, you know, not because they know they're perfect, but because they yearn for the world to be perfected, that are actually looking forward to this judgment. Not because they know their slate is clean. They know Christ, that God, a loving God, will help them with all of that. But they want to see the earth reborn back into perfection, and thus we have to judge and weed out all the things that are not right. And those who do not believe in this final judgment, this is the opposite of this piece of good news, can just live life whichever way they want. They can be prideful, they can strut around, they can hurt people, they can do all these things, but there will be consequences even for them at this time, even if they deny the reality of this. And that the people who've been victimized by other people, the downtrodden, will be vindicated at this time and it'll be made up for in some way. And the ultimate good news is that we will be fully redeemed and reconciled with God. And I really don't know what to say about heaven, which is, I guess, the ultimate piece of good news. I have a lot to say about the beatific vision, about why it might be hard to look at. I think I've talked about that, why it might be embarrassing, why it might be killing your ego, etc., etc., etc. But at the end of the day, I don't know why staring at something is going to be heavenly, And when people tell me that's what I have to look forward to, is just staring at God for eternity, I have a hard time getting very motivated by that mental image. But I have a friend from childhood. He was my best friend until third grade, and I haven't met him since then. Never met him since then, but I do know where he's at. He's somewhere in Southeast Asia as a missionary for the Seventh-day Adventists. And he told me in third grade that what heaven was like a roller coaster that just kept going and going, 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 going. And neither he nor I had ever been on a roller coaster, but a roller coaster was very much the symbol of perfect fun. And this I like better than saying you're going to be looking at God for eternity, even though it's less true probably. So, but I don't think but I do think what's very valid about it, though, is that we're given these images of heaven, the streets of gold and things like this. I don't think we should throw these images away. I think that these may help us understand heaven better than to get all theological on ourselves and just try to imagine staring at God.